When we remember a time, we remember moments. A kaleidoscope of the sights, the sounds, the emotions that remind us of the way we were. Our world. It's about time. Here are Linda Ellerby and Ray Gandolf.
For the next hour, think of your television set as a time machine.
But don't call the other passengers fellow travelers. Where we're going tonight, those are fighting words.
Welcome to our world. Last month, on November 4th, 1952, we elected Dwight Eisenhower president. Next month, on January 20th, 1953, we will swear him in. Those are our boundaries. Our story is what happened in the meantime. And that is a winter's tale about fear and frustration and the American way. Call it Red, White, and the Blues. Begin in Korea. A white Christmas spent fighting the Red Peril is enough to give anybody the blues.
The winter of '52 was an especially frustrating time for Americans fighting the war in Korea. They were containing communist aggression, not aggression against their country, but against a place some of them had never heard of before and didn't much like when they got there. They had been overrun once by the North Koreans, once by the Chinese, and in between they had chased the enemy all the way to the Chinese border. Now they're sort of nailed down in the middle of the country. Truce talks have been going on and off for a year and a half. The fighting has been going on for 2.5 years in broiling heat and sub-zero cold. And now it's December 1952.
December 52 was cold in Korea.
And that's when it snowed, and it was very cold. Our patrol had to go out every night. That was the worst thing.
Go out and hit them, but take no property. It was frustrating. A lot of boys died.
This is the United States Armed Forces Radio Service. Hi there, everybody. This is Air Force Sergeant Fred Burns once again saying welcome once more to Hot Off the Record Press.
I used to walk with you along the avenue. Our hearts were carefree.
Nothing was carefree or gay in Korea that winter. There was no ceasefire. There were no major military offensives. There were only soldiers continuing to fight for and die by inches. Casualties of a frustrating war they could lose but were not winning. The war was stalled because the peace talks were. Again, this time they'd fallen apart over the POW question. There was to be an exchange. However, nearly half the prisoners being held in the South said they didn't want to return to the North. The communists said they had to. America said they didn't. Stalemate. Hello, war. Goodbye, peace.
They were not ready for a peace treaty. The war was stalemated. It was a very difficult war. It was a war that, I guess by then we realized we couldn't win.
Correspondent Lou Giaffi covered the war for CBS News out of their Tokyo bureau.
Most of the time we spent in Korea. Our tour duty was anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the story. And it was, again, the same thing, the battle for the hills.
And it had been a big issue in the presidential election. General Dwight Eisenhower, war hero turned politician, had promised that if elected, he would go to Korea. In November he was, in December he did. His son, Major John Eisenhower, was already there.
I volunteered to go to Korea. So Dad very naturally was being rather generous to let me be in an infantry unit in Korea because the impact on him if I was captured would be terrible. So I just said, all right, well, I won't get captured. I can't guarantee I won't get killed, but I won't get captured.
The GIs really believed that Eisenhower was going to bring them home by Christmas. Of course, he didn't, but they did get home soon after that.
When he came over, the word got out that he's going to end it, with dignity, with pride.
Marine Corporal Robert Modica of Easy Company, 7th Marine Regiment. He recalls the cosmetic consequences of Eisenhower's visit to his unit.
They picked, the best-looking representative of a Marine image that had to be at least 6 feet tall. That would represent a Marine honor guard. The best-looking, tallest guys got picked for that. They also got to wear clean clothes, and take a bath, which was another event.
Eisenhower left Korea and said that there was no simple formula for victory. For our allies and for us, it had become a frustrating war of attrition.
The War of the Hills, the war for Old Baldy. They called it Old Baldy because they'd fought back and forth and taken it and retaken it so many times. It had been bombarded so much, there was nothing on it.
I was 22 when I was drafted, and I was 23 when I was in Korea. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on top of Heartbreak Ridge.
For a young Army Corporal James Robinson, Heartbreak Ridge lived up to its name.
I'd just been up there 1 week, and a patrol got shot up pretty bad that night. I was on Heartbreak Ridge 33 days.
As the third Christmas of the Korean War grew near, nobody was gaining, nobody losing. The fighting went back and forth in the bitter cold, both sides seeking always to capture or retain the frozen high ground. Porkchop Hill, Vegas, Carson, Reno. Bob Modica's Marine unit was on Reno.
Serial Ricky, tough guy from Chicago, like a brother. He was a machine gun squad leader by now. One night the Chinese overran Reno. One of his guns, the barrel burnt out. A round came in and hit him in the back of the head, and he died of wounds.
For those who receive the bodies of sons and husbands, Christmas is the cruelest of seasons.
Is there somebody I'm longing to see? I hope that he turns out.
For the living in Korea that Christmas, there was little to celebrate save their survival. That was enough.
I spent Christmas in Korea. Not a very happy Christmas. You try to make it as happy as you can. For the, the religious people, the believers, if you will, the good Catholics and so on, it was a great comfort to have the Cardinal come and visit us. He came all the time. And Billy Graham also, for those, the Protestants and so on. Everywhere we would go, you would find they make some kind of an effort to get something Christmassy, if you wish. So a lot of the things they had hanging in their tents was sent by their families from home. We were trying in an effort to give them a little feeling of being with family in Korea. They would dress up tanks. They would draw pictures and green paint on tanks with a Christmas tree and so on. The USO was active in the area. The main thing for the GIs, and the USO, all of it was a little bit of home. There was a flash of feminine leg, a beautiful blonde hair, not so funny comedian, but it was all kind of, let the war end for this brief period. Let me get a good look at home. Let me realize, remember what it was all like. And it's a respite from fighting.
That's all it was, a respite for the men who would remain and continue to fight. Marine Corporal Bob Modica was luckier. He was coming home for Christmas. He docked in San Francisco on December 22nd. 2 days later, he was flying to New York City. And at about 11:30 on that Christmas Eve, he was walking down the block in his old Far Rockaway neighborhood in Queens.
I walked up to the stoop, rang the bell, and as the door opened, my dog brushed right by my father, leaped this gigantic collie, almost knocked me down the stoop. I could have gotten killed at this most magic moment in my life, at my concussion. And I grabbed my father. My mother was screaming, and I was home. I was home.
Home. I have a son. I try to imagine being in that house on that Christmas Eve. I imagine Bob Modica's mother. Then I imagine another mother in another house. It's in Chicago. Bob's friend, Serial Ricky, used to live there, but he went to Korea to fight communists, and they killed him. Here in America, in his hometown even, communists were alive and well. They ran for office. They had their own newspaper. They weren't Koreans. They were Americans, many of them. When I try to imagine how I would feel about that, if I were that mother in that house that Christmas Eve, I began to understand something about the fear that could make people in this country see red. Come back to a cold winter's tale. Bring the family. Welcome back to the winter of 1952. Time to talk about freedom. For example, these modern appliances were supposed to set women free. The electric frying pan, blender, bottle warmer, iron, not to mention the electric waffle iron. Now that's freedom. Well, free to do what? Most women didn't work outside the home, weren't encouraged to, and if they seemed to prefer security to freedom, well, there was a lot of that going around. For 2 years now, this man, Senator Joseph McCarthy, insisted that the security, if not the survival of America, was in grave and immediate peril. There were communists everywhere, he said. They were to blame for everything, he said. It was the politics of fear, and it was catching. He said communism had to be stopped at any price. And hadn't he already told us what wouldn't work?
I don't intend to try to fight communism and corruption State Department fashion with a silk handkerchief. Can't be done.
Red hunting was popular sport that season, not just the brutal, cynical Joe McCarthy, but Senator Pat McCarran's Internal Security Subcommittee, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and various state, local, and private organizations all were in full cry. The Supreme Court refused to review the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, convicted and condemned to death for passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Government films, even newsreels, reinforced our fears.
We are engaged against the communists in a struggle for the minds of men.
Not even the Boy Scouts were immune.
We have knowledge of certain attempts by communists to secure positions of leadership, either in a scout unit, a council, or in the professional ranks.
You are.
In My Son John, a feature film starring Helen Hayes and Robert Walker, a family with 2 sons fighting in Korea learns that their 3rd son has become a communist.
Where's John? Isn't he coming today?
Oh, well,
He was detained. I swear that I am not now or ever have been a member of the Communist Party. Feel better?
It was not prudent that winter to march or demonstrate on behalf of socialism or labor unions or equal rights for blacks. Any deviation toward the left was suspect. Communists were believed only when they repented and recanted. My son John, murdered by his communist friends, records a message for the graduating class of his former college.
I am a traitor. I am a Native American communist spy. And may God have mercy on my soul.
The parents of 19-year-old Peter Albertson were members of the Communist Party.
The kids would stand across the street and yell, "Commie, go home," or to kill the communists. It only affected the family and, the personal relationships in ways that were unexpected. It drew us much closer.
Albertson's father, William, was indicted on charges of conspiring to advocate the violent overthrow of the government. George Crockett was a young lawyer who defended naturalized citizens who had been accused of lying about past communist sympathies.
Each of the people that I defended had been actively associated with the trade union movement. I defended Stanley Novak, who was an organizer for the International United Automobile Workers. Those who wanted to do a job on them claimed that they were members of the Communist Party.
A lawyer defended accused communists at his peril.
I went to prison for 4 months. In a period of hysteria such as we are talking about now, many of your very close friends no longer want to be seen with you.
If your friends didn't want to see you, chances are it was because your government did. Here in the federal courthouse in New York and throughout the country, the search was on for subversives in government. And meanwhile, civil defense told us to prepare for attack. After all, now the Soviets had the bomb.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
A vast segment of the population was firmly persuaded of the immediacy of the communist threat.
What American, without special training, can understand an enemy that would attempt to infiltrate our Boy Scouts?
Ambrose Salmini, once an ordinary citizen, now a man with a mission.
There was a great deal of frustration. People didn't know what to do about communism. What did they do?
What Salmini did was to go public. He would spread the alarm, tell people the truth about communism as he saw it, and the truth would be his weapon.
You never beat a team or an opponent by hate alone. But hate alone is a poor weapon. Millions of Cretans in China and Europe also hated communism, but today they are slaves. I did get 3 experts on various phases of communism. Each made a half-hour recording. And I was most fortunate in getting Bishop Fulton Sheen, who spoke on communism and religion.
There are no moral boundaries beyond which a communist believes he ever trespasses.
I had to sit down at night with my good wife and my children as best they could. It was something I enjoyed, and it's something I had to do. I just felt I had to do this. I packaged these in albums and made them available to individuals, to schools.
But some schools were way ahead of Salmini. For example, in New York City,
the superintendent of schools, through his deputy, informed 6 teachers that they have vacated their positions because they refused to testify about Communist Party membership before a subcommittee of the Congress. We have unanimously concluded that the action was justified.
The atmosphere of hysteria, the atmosphere of intimidation was rife.
Dr. James Moss taught at Dillard University and was involved with a committee that worked for civil rights in New Orleans.
Near the end of that semester, the president of the university called me in and indicated to me that he had heard that I was taking leadership in this committee, and that they were a bunch of communists, and I was being duped by them. And he made it very clear to me that if I chose to continue to associate with these communists, then I could count on not teaching at Dillard the next year.
So he went to Queens College in New York, but by Christmas 1952, Moss was finding out it might be a different school, but it was the same story.
The government had planted within your classes people who were posing as students to monitor what comments you were making, as I've been making in class since I was...
In the name of freedom, and in every field, the government seemed determined to expose and, if necessary, destroy those Americans who believed political freedom meant freedom to be a communist. The president-elect and the vice president-elect both visited the UN that winter, but a Senate committee was already there, and it was looking for communists.
There was a all-pervasive fear that ran through everything, and I found it in my family for sure.
In 1952, Dr. Caroline Feller Bauer was simply 17-year-old Caroline Feller, high school senior. Her father worked at the UN, and the McCarran probe of the United Nations would make a significant difference in her life.
My father was never under any kind of suspicion whatsoever, but he wanted to save that which he felt strongly about, which at the time was the United Nations.
Abraham Feller had spent much of his life in public service. Right then, he was top lawyer at the United Nations and counsel to Trygve Lie, the Secretary General of the UN. Feller firmly believed the UN was the world's best hope for peace, and although he was not under suspicion, when the McCarran investigation triggered firings of some of the U.S. workers there, Feller was devastated.
We were going on a shopping trip the next day to buy some long gloves to go with an evening dress for a dance. And when I got to the apartment house, the elevator man said, "I'm sorry for what happened." I didn't even know what he was talking about. Got up to my door, and I heard voices behind the door when I knew there shouldn't be voices. And the entire apartment was filled with friends of my father. And of course they had sent someone out to find me, but couldn't. And I heard that my father had died, and indeed had killed himself.
Abraham Feller had torn himself away from his wife's grasp and jumped out of a 12th-story window in his New York City apartment. He had been accused of nothing, suspected of no communist affiliations. But his job, defending American employees at the UN from accusations against them, that job put such a strain on Feller that he simply cracked. Come back to Christmas Eve, 1952, and some French sailors who ran afoul of the Grinch.
Our world continues. Fear and frustration in the winter of '52.
Welcome back to the winter of 1952. The fear of communist military aggression and the determination to hold the line against it continues in Korea. The enemy there is visible, clearly defined. In this country, the fear of communist subversion continues to flourish. But how do you fight an enemy who wears no uniform? How do you tell a spy from a communist sympathizer, a fellow traveler, an idealist, or a frustrated loyal American who simply believes that he shouldn't have to prove that loyalty by swearing to it? In the winter of 1952, the answer seems to be bag them all.
And once you've got them, if you can, kick them out of the country. Then make sure not to let any more of them in. Which brings us to the President, the Congress, and the nation of immigrants. And that brings us to the McCarran-Walter Act. It would revise our immigration laws. Congress had passed it back in June. In many ways, it was a fine bill. For example, it removed race as a barrier to becoming a U.S. citizen. But then it added new rules, rules allowing the government to keep out any immigrant and deport any naturalized citizen if the government decided that person was subversive. Due process was not mentioned. Many Americans believed this was unconstitutional. One of them was President Harry Truman. He vetoed the bill. But Congress, certain the majority of Americans agreed with the proposed changes, voted to override the veto. President Truman then appointed a commission which reported back to him that the bill was an arrogant and brazen instrument of discrimination. But it didn't matter. It was too late. On the day before Christmas, 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act became law. I don't know how Representative Francis Walter felt that Christmas Eve, but Senator Pat McCarran was one happy fella.
That is one of the most salutary pieces of legislation that has ever been enacted in the United States for the internal security of the United States.
Walter Judd of Minnesota was a Republican congressman and colleague of the bill's co-sponsor in the House, Francis Walter.
Francis Walter was highly respected. Francis Walter didn't go along with that so-called anti-communist stuff in the beginning, but when he studied the thing carefully, he came out convinced that there were serious threats to our own security from persons who had communist sympathies and who were applying for or being naturalized under the previous law.
The Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, gateway to America, they have always been, properly, symbols of hope. But there was always a little fear here, too, of the unknown, and frustration at bureaucratic red tape, and sorrow at family left behind in the old country. The McCarran-Walter Act magnified those apprehensions. It broadened the grounds on which foreigners already legally here could be deported, and not just immigrants, but temporary visitors, students, tourists, could be denied entry if their presence here was deemed to be prejudicial to the best interests of the United States. And it didn't much matter who did the deeming. Sam Burnson worked for the Immigration Service, screening prospective immigrants on Ellis Island.
One of the things that would happen every so often is that someone would make an accusation against the person coming in and say he was a communist. That was the kiss of death, because that person would be on Ellis Island for years. They could be excluded without any hearing, no hearing. no representation by counsel, no statement of the charges.
Felix Kuzman, born in Estonia, had lived legally in the United States for more than 20 years without ever becoming a citizen. That hurt him.
Special attempts would be made against people who are not citizens.
Kuzman's wife fared little better, and she was born in this country. When her husband was suspected of having communist connections, Helen Kuzman shared the harassment.
They did this by frequent visits from the FBI, who would visit at home, attempt to talk with us. Numerous phone calls, people would follow us. When we were in the car, we were followed sometimes. They would use all kinds of subterfuges. They used the subterfuge of calling me at work and telling me that they were investigating my mother's credit rating. Actually, my mother had been dead over 4 years.
When Uncle Sam pointed his finger, even the mighty trembled. Charlie Chaplin, a subject of Britain, was overseas plugging his new movie Limelight that winter. He chose to remain in Europe rather than face a rising furor in this country over his alleged communist sympathies. His American wife, Una, came back alone to put their affairs in order. You knew there was a climate of fear when our propaganda told us there was nothing to be afraid of. One classroom film featured this Thanksgiving Day message.
For knowing that a knock on our door means nothing to fear. It's not going to be some political gangster coming to drag one of us off to jail because we believe in freedom.
Oh, it was night. They were at home. Stanley Novak was accused of being sympathetic to communism. He was a naturalized American citizen. However, his wife and daughter, both of them were born here.
Our family was gathered for Christmas Eve celebration. The bell rang, and our daughter Lisa ran to the door, expecting a package or maybe some member of the family who had not arrived yet, and she found a man there asking for her father. So when Stanley went to the door, the man handed him a paper and announcing that civil proceedings were initiated against him to revoke his citizenship.
Stanley Novak, who thought he was an American.
Well, it was undoubtedly quite a surprise, and we realized that we are facing some very serious problems. Yes, we either have to break up the family or move the family to Poland if they lose the fight. But after considering very seriously, we came to the conclusion, the three of us as a family, that we're going to fight. This is my country. I'm a citizen of this country, and I'm going to fight for that citizenship.
Citizenship? All the French sailors on board the French liner Liberté wanted was shore leave, without having to prove they were politically pure enough to walk the streets of New York. It was no secret the Liberté was due to dock in New York right before Christmas, which happened to be when the McCarran-Walter Act became law. Among the ship's passengers was U.S. Immigration Inspector Leonard Martin. He was not on vacation.
I was assigned to board the ship on December the 9th, sail from New York to La Havre, inspect the crew on the way over, and on the way back to the United States.
What a coincidence. Senator McCarran himself also happened to be on a ship that also happened to dock in New York on Christmas Eve. But most of his crew was American. The others gave the right answers and got to go ashore. Meanwhile, 270 French sailors were stuck on the Liberté, not for giving the wrong answers, but for refusing to answer these new questions at all. Through their union representative, sailors explained to the American press that they weren't Americans, and were not asking to be. Francois Laguardia described the interrogation.
For example, the cook was asked if he washed his hands after going to the toilet. The people were amazed to be asked such questions. And even if they had been communists, they were free to be. They did not have to say so to foreigners.
I felt that I had done about as much as I could to advise them to answer the questions. If they chose not to, I had no alternative but to detain them on board.
It was December 24th. And at midnight we expressed ourselves. We sang the Marseillaise.
And 3 days later, the Liberté set sail for France, leaving behind America and the gift it had once given America.
On the way back, we had the illusion that the Statue of Liberty had a policeman's hat on its head and a stick in its hand, which represented, if you wish, the image of what we had just suffered during our stay in New York.
Didn't anything nice happen that winter? Weren't people having fun? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, they were. Come back to the winter of '52. Come back to George Shearing and Tony Bennett and Eddie Fisher and lots more.
Our World continues in a moment.
Great classic Singin' in the Rain had come out earlier in the year and was still boffo at the box office. But that winter was great for turkeys. Blackbeard the Pirate, Bamba and the Jungle Girl, Babes in Baghdad, and that's just the B's. With movies like that, no wonder Hollywood was afraid of television. So it countered the little screen with the giant screen, Cinerama. And it also gave us Buona Devil, the first real feature 3D movie, not counting a couple of early efforts in the 20s. Buona Devil gave you a headache unless you watched it with special glasses on, and maybe even if you did. Hollywood also was eyeing that winter's bestseller lists and would soon be translating to the silver screen The Caine Mutiny, Giant, A Man Called Peter, and The Old Man in the Sea.
And the way we went about our music had to do with the way we went about our lives, divided according to race, region, and rhythm. Passing, maybe nodding, but not really listening or speaking to or learning from each other. That would change, at least in our music, but it would take time. Still, if you listened hard in the winter of '52, you'd swear you heard whispering. Hal Jackson was a disc jockey who spoke and understood several musical languages.
I was on 3 different radio stations in New York City every day.
When he and the music were live from Birdland, the language was jazz, and the program aired on WABC. On WLIB, he spoke rhythm and blues. And on WMCA, he was conversant with the pop singers of '52, the stars and the newcomers.
Speaking of the 52 and the new people on the scene, would you believe Tony Bennett?
The young Tony Bennett recorded what Columbia Records wanted, pop singles.
In those days, it was on such a budget that we had to do 4 sides in 3.5 hours. And those songs, it's quite a lesson actually, because those songs actually became everlasting songs. Because of you, the sun will shine. The moon, the stars will say that you are mine. Forever and never to part. In those days, you weren't, if you were a popular artist, you were not allowed to do an album. That was only reserved for classical musicians. And to fight to get an album out, there was such a demand that I became very popular with all the teenagers, and finally I said, okay, do one.
His first album didn't include his favorite song.
Blue Velvet. I still love that song. In fact, I'll never forget it because my favorite singer, well, my mom's favorite singer was Ella Fitzgerald. To this day, that she's my favorite singer in the whole world. And I couldn't believe it. Being this nervous young crooner, my mom wanted to see her on her birthday, so we went to Birdland and saw Ella Fitzgerald in Birdland. And she came over to me and says, I love that record, Blue Velvet. And I just will never forget that moment. You know, it was a fantastic era. It was a land of geniuses. It's something we all took for granted in the United States. It really came out of the Apple here in New York City. But, you know, you had Charlie Parker. You had Billie Holiday. You had Duke Ellington. You had Count Basie. You had Stan Kenton. You had George Shearing.
George Shearing composed this classic in 10 minutes.
10 minutes to write, and of course 35 years in the business. Lullaby of Birdland, whisper low, kiss me sweet, then we'll go flying high in Birdland, high in the sky up above, all because we're in love.
The Latin influence in jazz was at its peak that winter.
It was really rampant because then we had, you know, Machito and Charlie Parker, and there was a great mixture of Latin and jazz.
The influence of one would come into the other. It was not a way out thing to have a Sarah Vaughan and maybe a Dizzy Gillespie at Birdland and have Machito and Tito Puente on the same lineup.
When Dizzy and Machito got together, there was a lot of interplay between jazz and Afro-Cuban music that certainly affected our R&B things.
When the co-founder of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Ertegun, talks about R&B, he means, of course, rhythm and blues, race music.
This, in 1952, was considered underground music. It was hip. It wasn't known to most people. It was only known to those who really dug it, who really understood it, who felt it, who loved it, who were discovering black art for the first time. And that's how rock and roll was born.
This guy had such a feel for rhythm and blues, and I'm telling you, not only did he write many of the hits, like, you know, he was a part of it. Ruth Brown's Mommy, He Treats Your Daughter Mean, The Clovers.
The way they rock and roll and how he paints a child.
The white kids who could not hear this music on the white stations discovered one thing.
that everything else in the South was Jim Crow, but they couldn't Jim Crow the dial. It cost nothing to turn the switch and switch to a black program. And when they heard that music, they loved it.
But you did have to switch the dial. Rhythm and blues was not yet mainstream radio, even in New York, where Hal Jackson and the other DJs played the pop tunes. And one of the most popular pop singers that season was a young soldier named Eddie Fisher.
Right from the night I first saw you, my heart has been yearning for you. What else could any heart do? Da 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 dee dum. See, I even forgot the words, and they're so simple.
Fisher, the GI crooner, called himself President Truman's favorite private first class.
Truman is the man and the president that sent me all over the world to sing. And I said, I want to go to Korea. He said, Eddie, not only am I going to send you to Korea, but I'm going to send you all over the world. I really did a tour, every camp in Korea. The people that I met, the young boys like myself, I met really wonderful guys. I see them all the time now, all over the country. And I got goosebumps just now, remembering those wonderful years. Oh, those years, good years, great years. My 2 years in the United States Army were the best years of my life.
They're not making the skies as blue this year. Wish you were here, as blue as they used to when you were near. Wish you were here, and the mornings don't seem as new, brand new as they did with you. Wish you were here, wish you were here, wish you were here.
Wish you were there? And how did we get here from there? And what did we bring along with us from that winter of '52? Come back to the ghost of a Christmas past. That winter of '52 is a black spot in American history. An irrational fear of communism led us sometimes to suspend liberty in the name of protecting it. But that's easy to say from 1987. It's easy to judge from here. And it's always dangerous to oversimplify. But this is television, and our hour is almost up, so here goes. The winter of '52, fear of communism, frustration in Korea, and on 52nd Street, some fascinating rhythms. Red, white, and the blues, and the blacks and the greens, and oh yes, the pinks and the yellows. 35 years have passed since then. Let's see what time has done to the colors of that winter.
How do you keep a song from fading too fast?
Tony Bennett didn't fade. And Eddie Fisher is still around. And George Shearing and the music. What was good lasted.
It's good morning out there. Sunday morning classics. Al Jackson, relaxing with Jackson.
Inner City Broadcasting Company Vice President Hal Jackson is still around and once a week still plays vintage hits. The underground race music evolved from rhythm and blues to Main Street rock and roll.
The Korean War ended in a draw. More than 1 million people died, mostly Korean civilians. 33,629 Americans were killed in action. 3,700 American prisoners of war came home. 2,200 men are unaccounted for. An armistice was signed in July of 1953, and ever since, the former belligerents have eyed each other across the demilitarized zone. Today, South Koreans can hold political demonstrations at their peril, risky business, but it's a risk the North Koreans dare not run. James Robinson is back home in McLeod, Oklahoma. His father, a lifelong Democrat, had voted for Eisenhower because he thought Ike would bring the boys home.
So help me God.
Eisenhower's inauguration in January of '53 was televised, live. Millions of people watched as America got a Republican president for the first time in 20 years. But it would be another 2 years before the fear of communism and the fear of McCarthyism would begin to ease. Stanley Novak did what he said. He and his family fought for his right to stay in America all the way to the Supreme Court and won.
His case was one of the few cases that my law firm was able to win as far as denaturalization was concerned.
George Crockett went into politics and is now a Democratic congressman from Michigan. During hearings on the Iranian arms deal last month, Crockett, in an ironic twist, heard somebody who was not his client take the fifth. The McCarran-Walter law can still ban anyone deemed prejudicial to the interests of the United States. Koichiro Yatani, a college teacher in New York, returned from abroad last summer to find his name on the list. A father of 2 U.S.-born children, he was held for 44 days.
I was arrested by the immigration officers without any explanation.
And it is the same clause in the same act that prevents Nobel Prize winner Gabriel Garcia Marquez and other noted writers like Farley Mowat from being free to visit America. Frustrated, the U.S. literary community has protested, so has some of the Congress. The protest will not change it. What was done in fear in 1952 still stands and will until the law itself is changed.
Well, there it is, the way it was for a couple of months in the winter of 1952. Until the day when nations lay down their arms and agree to abide by whatever national boundaries then exist. Until that day, free people must protect themselves from foreign aggression. But must they also protect themselves from foreign culture, alien thought, unconventional ideas? Hitler thought so. The Soviets think so. In the winter of '52, many Americans thought so. Some still do. But maybe we have learned that when you throw out the whole barrel because one apple is rotten, pretty soon you don't have any apples at all.
In December 1952, a United States senator announced there was an Iron Curtain conspiracy to flood the American market with Christmas tree ornaments. I can see how that could scare a person. But if there was a red menace, there was also a green menace to worry about during that holiday season. Another conspiracy. Another threat to the American way was taking root, so to speak. On January 4th, 1953, in Lafayette, Georgia, a carpet made of tufted plastic was offered for sale. By the time we learned to call it AstroTurf, it would be too late to kill it. However, lest you leave depressed, there was, that same January, one note of encouragement. The NAACP reported that 1952 had been the first year, since they'd been counting, in which there were no lynchings in the United States. No recorded lynchings, that is. And so it goes. Also in the winter of 1952,
John F. Kennedy, age 35, was sworn in as the new Democratic senator from Massachusetts.
the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission exploded the first hydrogen bomb on Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific.
George Meany was elected president of the American Federation of Labor.
Walter Reuther was elected president of the CIO.
In Denmark, George Jorgensen went in